Hello. For those who don't know me, my name is Madeline Hall, and I am a Senior Catchment Advisor at the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Thanks very much for coming along. Sean is going to give us a nice welcome for the day and a bit of health and safety. Then we're going to have Steve, our wonderful host, give us a bit of a rundown of the farm, and then I'll take us through the agenda and how the day will be running. So with that...
Thanks, Madeline. I probably don't need to say the Uru Rakau, everyone. Very warm welcome on behalf of Crowhorth and Hawke's Bay Regional Council. Thanks for coming out today and spending your time with us on what's not a bad Hawke's Bay day. We're expecting probably half of what we've got today, so thanks very much for spending your time with us. Big thank you to Steve and the trustees of Nisbett Taumata Estate for having us at your place today, and really looking forward to hearing a bit about your story and the work you've done over the last 30 years, Steve. But your health and safety, to get that out of the way first of all, as you come in you would have seen some buckets, and hopefully you've put your feet through those for the biosecurity. So if you haven't, could you please do that before we get underway with the first speaker, and we appreciate it if you could do that on your way out also. She's quite tight in here, so in case of emergency, we've got one exit here. Those of pretty agile and skinny disposition can probably get out the portholes, and the rest of us could get out there. So those of you sitting in business class out the back there, because you've got your own TV screen, you can probably head out here. So one thing I would say today is, unlike Air New Zealand, there'll be no Impossible Burgers out the back there. There'll be grass-fed protein from Waipawa Butcher, cooked expertly on the barbecue by Chris Gillibon and his team this afternoon. First aid, we have a couple of first aiders here. Emma Luxton, where is Emma's there. But and Madeline, in case of some CPR, you've got a choice between Dennis Hames and Mark Harris if he turns up. So take your pick there. And just a little bit like how this day sort of came about. I was just talking to Steve at the Hawke's Bay Biodiversity launch, and we're just having a chat about ETS, and there was a bit of confusion, and people didn't understand sort of some of the forestation stuff and what the opportunities and obligations were. So we thought, should we have a bit of a, maybe get some guys up and have a bit of a chat. Then Madeline joined in, all of a sudden this is where it's got to. So I guess it's just part of farming. Business is becoming more complex. And as your business becomes more complex, so does ours. So we've had to sort of change the way we work with clients too. So our family office model sees us put teams of specialists around clients to add value. So as well as doing that, we also get others to come in where they've got areas of specialty, and that's what today is about, bringing the information to the room. So I will just hand over to Steve to give a little background, and then Madeline can take over from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. That's excellent. Hey, so I've been here 30 years, as Sean was saying. This area was settled in the 50s. It was a ballot block. Most of the place was about 500 to 700 acres. This farm here is still the original size of 610 acres, or 247 hectares. It's the only farm on the road that still has its original owners, which were Donald and Joyce Nisbett. Donald sadly passed away in 1966, leaving 4 girls and Joyce to run the farm. So Joyce carried on the farm, employing labour, like shepherds, over the years. I arrived here in March 1998 from a farm in Crownthorpe, and when I got married, Joyce retired to Hastings and sadly passed away in 2012. So the farm now has been, I work for 3 of the 4 Nisbett girls, and it's good to see Jill here today, and Steve Larissy, the husband of Barbara Nisbett. So it's been good the last 30 years. I've been able to farm the farm as if it was my own, and I've got a passion for trees. And so thanks to them, I've been able to develop it how I want to. We've planted a lot of trees, I counted up before, probably about 5,000 poplars and willows over the years, and a lot of natives just recently with the help of the owners. So the stocking rate at the moment, we've got 1,050 ewes to the ram, 80 2-year bulls, 51 1-year bulls, 80 hoggets. We send the replacement hoggets out grazing every year, and then get them back as tudus. Just because the seasons can be pretty variable here, we get lots of droughts, and it just guarantees a good tudu when it comes back. So that's pretty much the basics to the place. I'll talk more later about the trees we've planted and what have you. And so I'm looking forward to this day because it's quite topical at the moment, and it's a lot of questions. So thanks for all coming.
Thanks very much for that. Steve has been a really wonderful guinea pig for all of this. So thanks for his patience. Really, without his hard work and cleaning the shed and keeping us on task, we wouldn't really be here today. So thanks a lot. With that, slide, please. Our agenda. So we've already gone through the welcome and health and safety. What we're going to be doing is having a few expert presentations, everybody's favorite topic. So we're going to be going over the basics of the emissions trading scheme. Then we're going to be going over how poplars and willows can fit into that. Then we're going to be focusing on natives. Then we're going to be doing some discussion around carbon neutrality. And then, thanks to the hard work of our experts, we've actually been able to do the carbon neutrality calculations for the farm that we're on right now. And I have to say I'm pretty excited about them. So, with that said, at the end of all those presentations, we're going to be having a Q&A panel. And because there's a heap of us, and we all have really great questions, I'm going to ask folks to write down questions on Post-it notes. There should be Post-it notes kind of sprinkled throughout. If you don't have a Post-it note close by to you, raise your hand at the end of this introduction, and we'll bring some over to you. Please write down your question and your name, and then kind of put them off to one side. We're going to collect those throughout the day, and then while Steve is talking about his wonderful poplar planting here, we're going to organize those a bit, so that way we can get the questions answered that are asked by the most people. Right? So that way we get as much as we can done. Then we're going to open the floor a little bit, and then we're going to have some wonderful barbecue and a bit of beer, if we can. Make sure you carpool. So, with that said, so this is just what I said written down. Make sure that you hold questions to the end. If you have them, write them on Post-it notes, send them off to the edge, and then we'll go through them at the panel. So, with that, we have Mr. Simon Petrie, who is a team leader at Uru Rakau. Yes, yeah. There you go.
Hello, how are we doing? I feel somewhat overdressed, I'll be honest. And get the memo about it. Oh, right, as Madeline said, I'm Simon Petrie. I am the operations team leader at MPI, which is now Uru Rakau. For my sins, what I do is I have operational oversight over the emissions trading scheme for forestry. Day to day, what that means is that I oversee the team that deal with the registration and application to register areas of forest in the New Zealand ETS, and I facilitate the transfer of carbon units to those and back to the Crown. Nice and short. Slide. So, the whole point of today, and I can't emphasise this enough, the stuff is complicated, so don't expect to leave from this understanding everything end to end. The idea is to sort of tear through, give it a red hot go, get you familiar with some of the concepts and stuff, and then you can go off and seek further information, and you'll find vehicles to be able to do that. So, first things first, the emissions trading scheme. It is linked quite clearly to New Zealand's international agreements. The original agreement is the Kyoto Protocol, set out to look at carbon levels at around 1990. The 1990 date will become significant a bit further on, but it's just worth keeping in your mind. The current agreement that New Zealand signed up to is the Paris Accord. The thing to note here is that all of the same things are measured. Forestry, waste, energy, agriculture, and industry. Those same things follow through. So the idea behind the ETS is that it's New Zealand's domestic contributions, New Zealand's international contributions devolve down to a domestic scheme. It's not linked directly, but the idea is that one mirrors the other, and that's where a lot of the settings in the ETS that we discuss shortly, that's where they come from. So, in terms of the what's, where's, and why's, the emission trading scheme quite simply is a domestic carbon market designed to put a value on carbon dioxide emission and absorption. We have one as New Zealand's primary tool to look to reduce carbon emissions nationally. And trees are in it because they absorb carbon. It's quite simply, it's the cheapest way to solve the problem. Next. There we go. So, in a nutshell, you've got three major bits. You've got factories here that generate power or make cars or burn coal or whatever else it is. You've got me, and you've got guys with trees. And again, so the unit of currency in the emissions trading scheme is an NZU or a New Zealand unit. It works out to 1 tonne carbon dioxide equivalent. So everything is managed in a uniform unit across the board. Just makes life easier. So emitters, people that are pumping it out, have to buy NZUs to cover the amount of emissions. So these people here do mandatory returns every year to the government saying that they've generated X amount of CO2, they're required to surrender units for that. And again, and sequesters, the people that own foresters, they apply back to the government if the land is registered to claim the carbon credits equivalent to the carbon that has been absorbed by the forest on their land. Nice and simple. Now the idea, that's right. Can we go back one? There we go. So the idea is that these guys here have got to get the units. The only people in town selling the units are these guys. That creates that simple market mechanism. The price is set and open. The government, there is a ceiling on it at the moment, but the price works against demand. So it moves up and down.
Is that ceiling likely to change?
I would suggest that it probably will do. I mean, the ceiling at the moment is $25, and it has been since the ETS was started in 2008. The current carbon price that we'll get to shortly is just north of 21. So whether the government chooses to keep it there or raise it slightly remains to be seen. My immediate guess is that you would likely see some shift in it. I wouldn't have thought that they'll remove it entirely and let the prices soar off, but the government wants the system to work with as minimal intervention as it can.
Can I ask for people to hold off questions until the end of a presentation, because otherwise we'll get really great
That's right. Sorry, my bad.
We'll be longer than
All right.
Thanks.
So now down to the specific bits. As I said before, the ETS works against New Zealand's international settings. So the stuff that we've picked here is not arbitrary. It's how New Zealand accounts for its forest land internationally. So these are the settings, and it's worth noting that they work across the ETS in both directions. That will be more clear in a minute. So what a forest is quite simple. We had to sit and define what it was. So it is trees that made up are a minimum of 5 metres tall at maturity, a minimum area of a hectare. Has to be at least 30 metres wide on average, not entirely, just on average, and you have to have 30% crown cover per hectare. The reason for this is to avoid unintended stuff. If you don't have the 30 metres wide on average, then all of a sudden you can get old shelter belts and stuff that farmers have had lying around for ages that can get inadvertently caught up in the ETS. The 5 metre height is also to avoid inadvertently including gorse. You don't really want to go out and charge your carbon credits for removing the old growth gorse from the back of your property. I doubt that I would be too popular. So that's the reason that those settings are there is that we capture exactly what we intend to capture and don't get too much in the way of other farming practices. Yep. So, as I said early on, the key date here is 1990. It links back to the Kyoto Protocol. So, forests and the ETS are treated in two different ways. The definition for forest stays the same across the board. Forest established before 1990 is treated differently to forest established after 1990. Established after 1990, we call it post-1989. Prior to 1990, we call it prior to 1990. Those are slightly confusing, but it's just the way that it's called. So the goal of today is to discuss how forestry works in this space. All forest here and back is considered baseline as far as New Zealand's carbon emissions are concerned. There are no further units given out for it. You can grow it, cut it down, regrow it, cut it down without liability. But it's this stuff here is where you can accrue carbon units as the forest grows and all the rest of it. Okay, so that's it. Main differences between the two. Pre-1990, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I assume slide packs are given out?
Yeah, if you have an email, then we'll send it.
Cool. So, as I said, pre-1990, baseline stuff. All established before 1990, they don't earn units. You can harvest and replant without surrendering units. You're automatically in the emission trading scheme of future forest. If you cut them down and you change the land use, or you leave it unstocked for 4 years, then there are carbon liabilities. That's how that works. And Indigenous forest isn't included because it's managed under a raft of other legislation. And again, the post-2009 stuff that we're interested in, exotic and Indigenous, so forest across the board, you can voluntarily register. If you don't register, you don't get units, you're unaffected, free and clear. you register units, you accrue carbon as the forest grows. You must surrender a portion of these units earned after harvest, because as you've harvested your trees, the carbon stock within them is considered to have decreased. So you accrue, harvest, you surrender a portion, replant again, accrue more, harvest, and go round and round. The graphs later on will understand that a bit better. And you must surrender all your units if you've deforested. The key concept here is harvesting and deforestation. Harvesting, grow it, cut it down, replant it, nice and easy. Deforesting is changing land use. Removing it, turning it into a paddock, or building a house on it, or whatever else is no longer forest land, it's now something else. Yep. Okay. Now, 3? And again? 3, that's it, yeah, that's fine. So these here are simple worked examples. I'm not going to go into it in detail because we're a bit pressed for time, but one of the key things for you guys to think about walking away from this, if you're looking to apply for this sort of stuff, is evidence and information. You've got to demonstrate what your land was back in 1990 versus what it is today, which is not all that easy because you didn't keep all the receipts for everything you did in 1990 because no one knew you were going to be here. So you end up with a bit of that sort of stuff. We try as best we can to consider everything and anything that is available to us. We have a whole raft of old historical and satellite imagery to look at land eligibility, but it can be difficult. However, the more information you've got and the clearer picture you can provide us, the more likely you are to get it through. So in a simple nutshell, 20 hectares of pine, planted in 1990, grazed since the 1960s, post-89, eligible, nice and easy. This is simple. Nice and clear, lovely little lines of pine trees, easy as you like. This one here, back paddocks. Back paddocks and regeneration can be difficult. Not impossible, but they can be difficult. 5 hectare back paddock, grazed since the 70s, livestock removed early in the 90s, manuka seedlings and off we go, post-89. Again, no forest there till after 1990, natural regenerating forest, we can demonstrate that through historical imagery, and off you go. Last one, slightly more difficult. Again, as I said, the gullies and the back pieces of farms that are retiring are often quite difficult because the management often has slipped and what's there is shrubs or reverting forest and stuff, so it can have some difficulties, but it's not impossible to get it sorted out. Again, 5 hectares, farmed since the early 30s, abandoned in the 80s, and then left to revert. So now it's neither one. Because remember, pre-1990 forest wasn't allowed to be Indigenous. It's been growing and reverting back since the mid-80s, so it's not included in anything. So, in terms of carbon and how forests work, there are sort of a couple of main areas where the forest exists. There's what's called the above ground biomass. Which ones? Oh no, go back. Sorry. I thought it was supposed to come up. There's the above ground biomass, which is the bit that's removed. That's the bit that becomes pulp or paper or building timber or whatever. And there's all the other bits, which is what they call the below ground biomass or residual biomass. So the above ground stuff at harvest is considered to decay immediately, despite the fact that it's a log and you can see it. For the purposes of ease of calculation, when they harvest it, that piece is considered to have oxidised and gone. The remainder is considered to decay at a fixed linear rate across 10 years. And again, despite that seeming complicated, the reason for it is to try and make a little easier all the calculations that you'll need to do later on to work out how this stuff works. Now, quite simply, the faster trees grow, the more carbon they absorb. So up the top here, you've got your pines. There's exotic hardwoods, the eucalyptus, Douglas firs there, exotic softwoods, and the slower growing indigenous trees. So obviously, the bigger and faster the trees that grow, the more carbon they absorb. The indigenous trees here are slower growing, yes, but they're also likely to be around for a lot longer. You're never going to get pine growing out, or crop pine growing out to 50 years because it'll all blow over. So there's sort of different growth rates and different uses for this timber, so it all behaves slightly differently. Right, now we get to the sharp end of the stick. This here, although complicated, because it is roughly how carbon sequestration works within a stand of pine. Don't worry about the numbers and working it all out. You can sit and puzzle your way through that later on. The idea is just to sort of have a bit of a gander and understand the key concept. So your trees here, registered here, starts to grow. There's a little blip there where you do your pruning and thinning and what have you. Grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. Get to your harvestable age at year 28. That there is the piece that I talked about around instant oxidization. So that there is the piece of log that's removed that's now sitting on the port. The remaining residual biomass, all your roots and stumps and slash and what have you, are considered to decay at a perfectly linear rate across 10 years. Now, the farmer or the forester in this case, because he's studious, has gone out the very following day post his harvest and studiously planted new trees in the ground, and they start to merrily grow up again, and that's the new carbon line. Now, you'll note that there's a piece here where, provided circumstances are correct and provided that you've registered very early on and you get planted again pretty quickly after harvest, you'll end up with a portion here that you will not need to surrender again. To have this system work, you need to make sure that you've got all your variables right and you've established the forest at the right time, and it's first rotation forest and things like that, but it is possible. You would do well to sit and work through in your own time some of these numbers and sort of get familiar with how this stuff works, because it changes a lot of how the economics of the ETS work. It's also worth noting that if you're planting permanent forest and retiring Indigenous forest and you're not planning to cut it down, then you don't have to deal with this bit. If it's in the ETS, it's just growing and growing and growing and growing, and if you're not cutting it down, there's no emission, so you're done. There's no need to surrender. Now, to take something that's hard and make it harder, this is what multiple rotation looks like. So this is the sort of thing that larger scale forestry companies are doing. And obviously, I'm not expecting you guys to start running large-scale forestry companies, but it just as an idea of how different age classes can be treated. I think this is something that might be touched on a bit later on. But again, you've got one age class there, then another one, and the compounding carbon stock sits way up here, because the losses for one are met by the carbon gains of the other ones, and you can move it through. What I'm saying is, if you have your areas on your farm and you've got 5 or 6 hectares of pine up the back of one piece, and you've got another couple over there or whatever else, looking at how they are set out and where the harvestable age is can change a lot of the economics around how this stuff works. And lastly, which is slightly more pertinent to sort of farm forestry, here's a pine example with a bit of permanent Indigenous. So there's, say, a hectare or two of Indigenous forest up the back that you've planted and decided to leave, you've let it revert, you've maybe put a QE2 covenant over it, maybe you haven't, but you're not intending to cut it down, it's just there. So that's permanent carbon, you're never going to have to surrender that, and the carbon that's growing there also eases some of the carbon loss at this point, so you end up with a wider buffer of carbon that you get, that you've got as an asset that you should not or will not need to surrender back, provided the top piece remains in forest over time. Okay, now that we've run through all of that, we're going to change it. So, I do apologise, we've had to go through that at fair breakneck speed to try and cover everything, it's cut me off, but that's how these things go. So, to take that awful graph that I just showed you and try and make it a bit simpler, because let's face it, it's quite tricky, the government is currently looking to start consulting shortly on averaging accounting. So, I taking this forest growth and boom cycle and averaging it out across the lifetime of the forest and saying, all right, if you guys are growing it, you're going to keep it in forest, you're going to harvest it and regrow it, fine. We'll give you carbon up to your long-term average, and then that's it. You keep it in forest, no more carbon for you, you don't have to surrender anything, it's done. You keep growing it in rotation forest over time, you've got your carbon that you can then use to go off and do whatever it is with, you don't have to worry about calculations, you don't have to ring me up, it's nice and easy, or easier. And then the other thing is there's a whole raft of small technical improvements of bits and pieces where the legislation needs a bit of a tweak here and there, things to make it easier for people like yourselves that are trying to interact with the system and land and things like that. Now, over and above all of this, some of you may have heard about Minister Jones and his 1 billion trees out there shovel in hand. And as you well know, he's out there looking to plant 1 billion trees over the next 10 years. So there's a number of different avenues with where work is sort of being considered and trying to be worked upon. So he's got a mix of exotic and indigenous species, commercial and permanent. A lot of it, I think, this point here is a fair one. When you think about the 1 billion trees, there's this notion that the government just wants to go out and cover the landscape in pine no matter what. And the idea here is about getting the right trees planted in the right places and for purpose, and thinking about long-term environmental effects and how it's the best use of the land and things like that. And as I said, we're currently in the design phase. We're looking for funding and support options to work out what to do. So there will be a whole raft of further information that will start to come out reasonably shortly about what this looks like and how you can best take advantage of it. Now, lastly, I've been doing this a fair while. I may have even spoken to some of you on the phone. I don't know. What I can tell you is that if you want to take anything away from this stuff today, despite all the massive confusion that I've laid upon you, it is these things here. Try as best you can to understand what you're doing before you do it. I talk a lot of times to people that have been given half information or some things or told part of the story and dived into something where they really realised later on, had with the benefit of hindsight, they probably could have or should have done things differently. In one of those cases there, the use of consultants is good. You know, MPI, Uru Rakau, have a call centre. We have a whole bunch of information that's on websites and stuff to help and assist people. There's also a whole bunch of forestry consultants that are private individuals out there that know this stuff, that interact with us, that can provide you guys with often better advice than, and sort of, I suppose in some ways, help you navigate through the weeds a bit and help to get to understanding. And the last, this one here is a good one. When you talk about the ETS, everyone talks about carbon growth and liabilities and risk and this and that. And, people are naturally risk adverse. If you break it down, the risk here in the ETS is not about registering your land. If you go back to the beginning of this, you apply to us to register your land, and it costs you $580 or whatever it is to register it, and you map it, and you get given it, and then we give you carbon units every year. Your liability is only ever capped at what we gave you. There is no risk at all in joining. You've then got a stash of carbon credits that you have there that are worth a marketable value. The risk comes when you decide to sell those units to capitalise on them. It's not money for nothing, but if you have an asset of units that you've got stored away there and then you decide you need to take advantage of, you need money quickly to do whatever it is, to buy or sell things or to take advantage of some other opportunity, you have an asset there, you have a pathway to do it. It allows you, it frees up money and resources. So the risk is not joining the ETS, the risk is simply selling your units, because when you sell them for the price they are at the time you sell them, and when you are required to surrender them later on for your harvest liability, you will have to surrender, or you have to give them back to the Crown at the market price on the day. Obviously, you've got your log full revenue to think about there as well, so it's a bit tricky, but the key point is the risk is not joining the ETS, it's selling those units. And lastly, it sort of gets back to my first point. Get advice or assistance before doing things. The amount of times that I have a phone call that says, oh, g'day, I've done this. Now what? That is not a good thing. If you're thinking about buying it, selling it, God forbid cutting it down, get hold of MPI or Uru Rakau or the call centre or someone or consultants and find out what the story is, particularly around buying and selling land. If you're looking to buy land that has forest on it, do a bit of homework about it, because as soon as you buy it and as soon as you own it, you can have ongoing liability for it. As long as you work out what you're doing ahead of time, it's a lot easier for you. And that's me. Oh, right, sorry. Aha, tricked you. Last quick key messages. Very, very quick. So, that's what I said before. Units are another asset for your farm. It's another store of value, another revenue thing. Land use around pre-1990 is the most important thing. If you're looking to register, that's great. Go back through your records, dig out your old photos, your diary entries, your receipts for spraying, your harvesting stuff, your fencing contracts, your stocking, anything like that. Time value of money. Forestry is a simple game, right? Plant trees in the ground, leave them, when they get full grown, harvest them, get money. It's all very well and good, but you're twiddling your fingers for 28 years. This here allows you to capitalise on your eventual log fall revenue by accruing carbon over time that gives you an asset that you can realise if and when you need to for other reasons. It's complex, but there's merit in that. And the point of risk here, as I said before, is the sale of your units. You'll never need to surrender more units than you've earned. So if you get them, you accrue them, and you hold on to them, you're risk-free. Yeah. And lastly, get some advice. And that's it for the second time. Great.
Thanks, Simon. So, as I said before, we're going to try to keep questions towards the end of the day so we can make sure we get as much content kind of thrown at you as possible. I know it's a lot. It will take a few times of hearing this stuff to get it, really. And plus, I'm pretty sure that there's actually quite a lot of those forestry consultants in the room. Can folks who consider themselves a moderate expert in this stuff please raise your hand? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Yep. So we have about 5, 6, 7 or so. Yep, so that's pretty good. Make sure that you find one of these folks at the end of the day. I'll ask them to raise their hands again. If you don't have Post-it notes, I have more. Okay, so I'll pass these back. So just pass them behind you. Great. And pass some more. Great. Okay. Good. So, yes. Thanks. Yep. So what we're going to do now is have Margaret Willis, who is from Masterton. She works for Woodnet, and she and her company are known throughout the country as being some of the best in working on including poplars and willows into this scheme. So as you can figure out, all this stuff is pretty complicated, and it's sometimes really hard to figure out how it can all work on farm. Margaret and her team are the experts in making that happen. So she's going to take us through some basics. She's going to go through some of the work that she's done for this farm that we're on, so we can get some estimate of what it actually looks like in real time. And then we're going to pass it on over.
I tend to wave my hands a little, so here we go. You'll be able to see past me because I'm shorter. Excellent. Okay, we're going to skip through the first couple so we can move on. Some information here. Okay, so, one back one. That's right. So my experience with poplars and willows in the ETS. So we're all on the same page. Same thing, different names. So spaced plantings, pole plantings, erosion control plantings, and hardwood plantings, all the same thing, okay? So making good land use decisions, as we all know, is actually part of farming, planting marginal land or for erosion control. Untapped potential on a lot of farms. And my biggest point today really is the ETS should complement existing land use decisions and future plantings that make sense. And the key point to understand about this is about eligibility and obligations, and specifically for erosion control plantings. Okay, things to watch out for. Crown cover and canopy size differs in cultivars. So when working with the narrower varieties, just be really aware that the reduced canopy size is a narrower drip line, and that's the potential of the tree. So therefore, tighter spacing is required to actually reach that forest land definition and that criteria. Modern varieties are bred for a limited crown size to actually maximise pasture growth. And the willow with Poplar Trust do some great work in that in the Manawatu. Lombardy is the obvious one, but a lot of these newer ones are going that way as well. Yeah. Right, I had some beautiful animations here where my tree grew, but you can imagine that. Okay, so the age of when trees are entered into the ETS can impact on the spacing. And this is one of those key tips that you won't actually find written down anywhere. So although the guidelines say that there's a 15-metre maximum between canopy edges, it's actually a little bit different on practice depending on what age it's entered. So the younger stems need a higher stems per hectare because they allow, the MPI mapping standards allow a 4-metre buffer. It's actually worked off the pine one. So that's the potential drip line that you can work to. For poles between 0 and 5 years. You can't add 4 and 4 and 15. In practice, what it actually works at is a 20-metre spacing maximum for your poles under 5 that works in practice. So that's a figure to remember. So 15 to 20 metres maximum on your perimeter poles in your stand. The later you enter a stand into the ETS, as it's closer to maturity, 15 years plus, you've got a 1 metre or a no buffer allowed. So it's working on the actual drip line and that 15-metre maximum. Okay, so because they're so spread out, survival is really important, and that equates to location and spacing. So entering a stand that's already well established, and by that I just mean roots established, can really aid you and limit some of those early problems. They're easier to see on imagery, which is often deciduous, and we all know trying to find Google Earth imagery for some of our rural properties is a bit of a nightmare because it's 10 years apart. Easier to locate on photos, and if you can't do that, then it's a matter of GPSing the base of the tree, the flagging tape, if you can't see the sleeves, etc. Okay, cover. So it's about exceeding the 30% canopy potential. You kind of don't want to be close to it because then you're really touching the limit too far. So minimum stems per hectare really depends on the canopy size of your potential trees. Just a couple of examples here. If you've got a 4 metre radius, you're looking at about 60 stems per hectare. 5 metres, you're looking at 38. 6 metres, you're looking at about 22. But if you're looking at Lombardies, which have got about 2 metre radius, you're looking at 240. So you can see that difference there. And looking at the property here with Steve, some of the older willows that were planted just after 1990 had up to a 16 to 18 metre canopy size, but those are some of the older varieties. So just be aware that those younger ones are going to have a restricted count cover in most cases. And I've just dropped the minimum stems per hectare in terms of the calculation there, so that's something for you to take away. You can either plant more stems, and a sneaky tip is you can also not include some gaps where you've got some pasture in the middle of some hardwoods. You can actually put in an optional gap to artificially increase your stems per hectare there, so also maximising your pasture, which makes sense because we're farmers. Okay. I think next, yeah. So because of the location and the reason for these plantings being there, they're often linear and in isolated pockets. So therefore they can often not reach that definition. So cover, size and width. So adding poles to increase the shape is really where you're at. Linking stands, but it's how you do this that's really important. You can do it smart. My kind of tip for today is instead of linking stands with a single row, do it with a staggered row of several. What you do there is you don't put the reliance on a single tree, and you're less likely to be impacted by poor survival. You can do that on the lower side of the slope rather than the upper exposed, and you're putting the trees in a great place. We've got an example of that to follow on this property. So the other thing about obligations is it's important really to monitor your stands, and that's really about replanting, to always make sure that you're reaching that criteria, knowing the line, making sure you've met it. MPI say the stands can be considered permanent as long as the tree crown cover potential is maintained. And that's really about replacing poles. So knowing what trees are alive and dead and replacing those ones that compromise and stop your land from meeting the forest definition. Carbon or trees that are removed must be accounted for on your emissions return. Harvest calculations, complicated, see a consultant. Otherwise, the MPI help desk are brilliant. So units must be repaid if the carbon stock declines across the stand as a whole, and Simon covered a bit of that before. Technically, there's no minimum area, but the amendments to the regulations are coming in here, and there's a suggestion that could be 0.1. If averaging comes in, then simply replacing the poles is going to cover your obligations. Riparians are popping up all over the place, and Ollie's going to cover this a little bit later, but adding hardwood poles onto the outside of your riparians and actually doing mixed plantings can really assist with that. So carbon growth is about a point on a growth curve. Therefore, the age of a stand really matters. And stands often have mixed ages, so it's a bit of a recipe. You can do a prorated age, but it's best to be location specific, because what that does is it future-proofs your registration, knowing what's planted where. If something comes out, you've got something tangible to work with, and believe me, the administration is a lot easier. Keep good records, how many poles where. Council records are brilliant. You can actually include some pre-1990 areas, depending on where they are, as long as they don't meet the forest land definition by themselves. So you can be smart about what you put on your registration. So as Simon said, if you're in the grey area, the onus is on you to provide that supporting evidence, receipts, flagging tape on your trees. But the great thing is you've got time to do it. Your registrations can be done by the end of 2022 to claim this 5-year period. So you've got 4 years to organise and to get all that done, which please don't wait till the end. Otherwise we'll end up with another 2017. Please don't. I can't emphasise that enough. We are standing today, but only just with the influx of work that's just finished. Okay. So a big point here as well is if your total registration, not your hardwoods, but your actual total registration is less than 100 hectares, your carbon for your hardwoods is based on the hardwoods tables, the regional tables, national tables. This is quite high, and I'm not going to draw too much attention to this because Simon might change the rules. But what I'm saying is, you saw Simon's graph earlier, that generally it's actually greater than pine at 15 years, about the same at 20, but it does plateau a lot further after that time. As soon as you go over 100 hectares, you trigger what's known as the FMA, which is the field measurement approach. And what that does is it measures the actual carbon present. So putting 2 and 2 together, if you measure the actual carbon present, and the actual in reality is less, it's best to not trigger the FMA on hardwoods. So in terms of the Taumata Nisbett Estate, Steve's patch here we are. So a bit of a disclaimer, we're covering existing and potential. This was a desktop only, a quick assessment, a lot of iometer used, and I haven't pushed the envelope too far, but I've got it in sight. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So existing stands, we've got about 34 hectares and about 5.7 hectares. Yeah. It's 5.7 hectares that doesn't meet the forest definition, and that's actually closer to 7 because I missed some. Either too narrow, too sparse, or too small. Yep. So you see the less than 30 metres wide at the top there, less than 30% canopy cover on the left, but you can see I've still mapped the stand that will reach that by excluding those trees, and less than a hectare contiguous areas on the right. So by themselves, they don't reach. Yep. So potential, what can we do with 200 poles? And I did count them, about 200. So it's about bridging external gaps, linking stands, filling in gaps. Yep. And here's a zoom of that same area. So you can see those little pale green circles there are some strategic pole plantings. And I have linked areas and reduced gaps and increased cover. And yep. And my slides, there we go. So what I've added, and this is a Margaret term because I made this up, it's called bolster poles. I thought that was a good word. What this does is it's just additional poles that aren't needed for eligibility, but what it does is it strengthens the shape of the stand. It increases the potential canopy cover, and it removes that grey area. You can see the bottom right-hand corner, there was a single tree that was pretty much reliant on this whole stand's eligibility, because if that tree wasn't there, I'd have to map in the gap at the middle, which would then make it not eligible. So I don't want to open myself up to having to make sure a single tree is standing for the next 15 years. So plant some beside it. It makes sense. Here we go. So 18.5 additional hectares takes us to just over 50. And as I say, the opportunities aren't endless, but they keep going. You can plant poles every day of your life if you like. But we're all farmers as well, obviously. Yeah. So what about units? Show me the money, as I got told once at a seminar. So this is what I've done is based this on a weighted average age for the specific stands. You can see the ETS started in 2008. It's at the top there, and the red represents units in time that has passed. So from 2018 onwards, you can see 5,207 tonnes for the current compliance period, if registered before the end of 2022. Next compliance period, just under 4,000, and another 2 and a bit following. So the 15 years for this potential is 11,681. Yep. Current carbon price, yep. Yep, just keep going. Yep. The money keeps increasing. Look at that. So 245,301 based on current carbon price. Why is it declining, I hear you say, before you get your notepad out? That's because there is you can see the 25 hectares averaged at 97. So a section of this forest, these trees have already reached their maturity. So their growth is declining over time. 2 minutes, thank you. And newer plantings could increase this, not including some older ones, could also be sneaky and actually bumping up your average age as well, but that's a sneaky tip. Take home points, yep. Okay, no, lessons I've learned. I made that cow, I thought it was pretty cool. So vegetation isn't a competing land use, but it's a species to consider. It has roots instead of legs. And I also got told at one point that you can't eat trees. And as Donald Trump would say, that's a true fact. You can't eat trees. It's not a smart thing to say, though, and it's in more ways than one. And as business owners, you yourselves will understand. As mentioned before, the ETS registration is linked to the land and the trees. So when you're going into the ETS, understand that the change of ownership and the removal of trees will impact your registration. So find out about it before any of those two things happen. What I wish I knew 10 years ago, I wish I'd done my BA in geography rather than English and history. It's good for crosswords, but, you know. Excellent career in land use for Ontuit people. And what I have learnt is the emotion is an ingredient in land use decisions. There's a lot of importance in my role in relationship building and trust building with my clients. And I guess it's the thing that I really enjoy the most about my job. Yeah, so key messages and take homes. Establishment year is important. We've already said that. Planting records, age for specific areas, great. Shape is important. Location, monitor it. Consider your timing. Difficult to map. Enter before the compliance period. 4 years to plan, plant, and enter. So very doable. There we go.
Great.
That's
Okay,
me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Phew, that was another whirlwind. So I guess aside from the key points already on the slide, that meeting that forest land definition seems like it's a really important thing. So it's that 30% crown cover, 1 hectare in size, 30 meter average width, and what's the fourth one?
5 meter height.
Oh, see, there you go. From the floor. Yeah. So, yeah, it's meeting that definition that's really important to make sure things count. And as we saw with some of these plantings, if you're strategic, you can get a heap more things in it. So I think Steve told me one time that he usually has a 200 pole planting regime, 300 every year, regardless of this. So, I mean, that makes a heap of sense, you know, just to think about where you be putting your poles to get more bang for buck. So with that, I'm going to again remind you to write down questions on Post-it notes. If they haven't gotten to you, shout out. Also, use these little things. Rather than going through the aisles and all that jazz, we're going to be heading outside to give you guys a bit of a break, a bit of a breather, after Ollie presents. And so please give your Post-it notes and questions to someone who has one of these little signs on. And then we're going to organize them so that when we come back, we can get things going. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Ollie Belton. He is one of the nation's experts in Indigenous forestry and how you can have Indigenous Indigenous forests work in the emissions trading scheme. So I'll let him take it away from there.
Thanks for Simon and Margaret as well. You guys have laid some good foundation. I think I'd only have to do about half of my planned. Sorry, is that better? Presentation. But yeah, look, today I'm going to talk about native forests. I deal a lot with exotic forestry as well. Yeah, my chiropractor will be very happy with this. Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to talk about native forests on farms. I'm going to talk about the main obstacles, hopefully trying to overcome some of those obstacles. And we'll do some economic summaries of different regimes and some common fish hooks to look out for with the ETS and carbon and natives. And actually we've heard a lot today about the ETS, but there is some other carbon schemes out there, so I'll talk about the different options as well. So basically everybody likes natives, we want more of them, but the last 100 years or so, forestry in New Zealand has really focused on plantation forestry and exotic species. So reasons being, natives generally cost a lot to plant and establish. They are pretty high risk and require a lot of care and cuddling. And then they take a long time. They take a long time to grow, and therefore that all adds up to a pretty low return, if there's any return at all. for timber. So current government, Minister Jones, Simon pointed out, is planning for 1 billion trees. What's 500 million, depending on what you read between the lines. And there has been some fear that it's going to be, radiata fever again. So there's a lot of discussion about what sort of other trees we can have, and hopefully some natives as part of that mix. So the question really is, can carbon revenue help to promote more people to plant natives instead of radiata pine? Next slide, please. So I got some bad news. Unfortunately, based solely on economics, natives don't do particularly well under the carbon for carbon income either. So Simon's already had one of these charts up, but on the right-hand side, this is taken from the default carbon tables that the government publish. We have different species, but right at the top, and ignore those circles, they've moved way off, but right at the top you've got radiata, and that's over 35 years, a 1 hectare stand up in this region, based on the default, would have earned close to 1,000 tonnes, which is 1,000 carbon credits. But for the same period, the Indigenous, which is down the very bottom, is only close to 300 tonnes, so that's 300 units. So you've got the difference between about 28 units per year versus 8 units per year. Now that chart as well probably underestimates the difference, because once we get out and measure, and Margaret was talking about field measurement, what we're finding is that actually radiata often does a lot better when you measure it than what this is telling you. Not always, but often. And the Indigenous actually does a lot worse in quite a few instances. So in fact, that gap in reality is often wider. Factor into that the cost side, and on the left-hand side here, you've got just a radiata versus Indigenous table. Radiata between $1,000 and $2,000 a hectare to plant. Indigenous, in some instances, you could be paying $20,000 to $40,000 a hectare, depending on the regime, and that's not unheard of for some councils to be paying that sort of money for restoration projects. So one thing we've got to ask is there a way we can sort of reach up the balance here? And one way is to try and reduce costs. Now, with the explosion with Manuka honey, there's a lot of work going into planting out low-cost regimes of Manuka. And so they have got some pretty good science now, and that's almost in line with sort of production forestry or plantation forestry. So costs can be down around $2,000 to $2,500 a hectare. But the big issue there is that you're planting a monoculture again, so it's none of that native diversity. And also, you're on the slow growth rates. I mean, Manuka is a colonizing species that really only grows fast initially, and then it slows right down. So looking at other things to do, you can plant a mixed species regime. I've made up a model here, which is a bit of a hybrid between some different models, and it's a red beech and Kanuka model, and that's planting 50% Kanuka and 50% red beech, and that's the purple line at the top there, and it puts on a lot more carbon, but that's going to cost you, and this is like really scraping the bottom of the barrel and doing it really tight, probably $5,000 a hectare. So you get more carbon, but your upfront costs have gone up, and unfortunately they kind of cancel each other out, those two things. So if you go to the next slide. So there's a lot of numbers up here. It's an economic comparison. But the key thing to take away from this is that the exotics, radiata, eucalypts, they do pretty well. This is using $21 a unit, and there's with no land value, and don't shoot me for that because obviously there is a value on land. But if we assume there is no land value, then you've got 19 to 16% rate of return. But for those two planted regimes for Indigenous that we had on the previous slide, they're both at about 3%. Now, on the far right, we've got the passive regen regime, which is the most common one, I'd say, in New Zealand, which is lock up the back paddock, stop spraying it, let it regenerate, and let's make some money out of it through carbon serendipitously. That's at 15% there, and that's because there's no cost. There's no investment cost at all. You've done basically nothing. Now, if we add in land value, which I am quite keen on adding in land value, in here there's a $4,000 a hectare land value. It basically kills the economics in terms of the natives, drops them down to minus 2% and just over 0.2%. So a few other things as well around the passive regen, which you have to be mindful of, because people get quite excited about it. And in fact, that 15%, I've seen some models as high as 21%. It's very site specific. I've been to places that they've locked up a paddock and it's still in rank grass 20, 30 years later. So in some areas of New Zealand, where there's good soil fertility, good rainfall, lack of animals, you can have some amazing regen. In other places, there's nothing happening for decades. So it's not a very smart strategy in all places. Next one. Okay, so this tool I find quite useful. It's comparing how much it would cost to create one carbon credit from different species. And so basically you get the net present value of all the costs involved and divide it by the net present value of all the carbon that you earn over a period, say 50 years, and it will give you different numbers. So if we wanted to say we were looking at an 8% rate of return on investment, it would cost you $35 to plant that manuka. To get one carbon credit from the planted manuka, it would cost you $35. To compare that with the radiata, that's going to cost you $8.60. So looking at this table, you can see what the carbon price would have to be in the market to get an 8% return. So basically, it's pretty clear here what's the winner. Well, actually, the passive regen on the right is the winner, but there's high risk, that one. Next slide, please. So yeah, there's other ways to try and reduce the costs. You can avoid the field measurement approach, try and keep it under 100 hectares, as we've already heard. I mean, I often say to clients, if they're going to register, say, 150 hectares, they may as well register 99. They're probably going to do better under the table, and they'll have less costs. There's opportunities out there for getting seedlings sometimes. MPI have recently had a process where I think it was 1.8 million seedlings were put out for basically for tender for free. You've got groups like QE2. You can get QE2 covenants that help with fencing and other things. And then the most well-known funding is through regional, local government, and also state through the government, central government, and that would be things like the Afforestation Grant Scheme, which I'm not sure do we know if it even will exist going forward, or it's...
It is currently, I intentionally didn't mention it. Hello. I intentionally didn't mention it only because it is currently under further analysis. It has been running for sort of about 8 or 9 years now, and because of a raft of things to do with the billion trees things and stuff, the official line is that it is currently not in operation.
Yeah.
What happens moving forward in line with Minister Jones's billion trees things and all the rest of it remains to be seen, but that is essentially where it sits at the moment. But I would suggest that you keep a close eye on that space.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Well, nonetheless, I'll keep talking about it because that's been a really powerful incentive for native establishment, actually, because with the AGS, it was a $1,300 upfront payment, well, at the end of the first year of establishment. And so, and in return, the landowner gave to the government 10 years worth of carbon, the first 10 years worth. But for natives, if you remember those graphs that both me and Simon put up, they earn very few carbon credits in the first 10 years. So you're actually getting a pretty good whack of cash up front for giving away a very low amount of carbon. So it was a real boost and really helpful. So then you've got to ask, why would you do natives if the economics don't really stack up? And I guess the main point here is that most parties are not doing it for an economic return. I mean, if you're establishing natives, it isn't to make money. There'll be some other reason you're doing it. So some of the larger landowners who are doing native forest projects in New Zealand include not-for-profit restoration trusts, such as Native Forest Restoration Trust, Hinawai Reserve. Hinawai's in Banks Peninsula in Canterbury, and they have been working for about 30 years protecting remnant beech forest and also enlarging the area and restoring degraded farmland. You've got regional councils and local councils who have got large tracts of land that they have retired back into native forest and for recreational purposes and local biodiversity. And you've got the main one at the moment really is Manuka, is honey production. So carbon for those parties, well, especially the Manuka honey farmers, the aparists, carbon is a bonus. And it's not a huge bonus. When you talk to them and say, well, this is how much carbon there is, it's kind of like, oh, that's pocket money, cherry on top. But that's not the main driver. So here's another option for the less native purist and for parties who have got a very long-term view. And I've been involved in a few projects like this, and that's using exotic species to fast-track the carbon in the early stage, but integrate it with natives. And really the idea is you're not thinking 10, 15 years out, you're thinking 100, 200 years out. What is that going to look like in 200 years? So on the right there, that is a 15-year-old forest eucalyptus planted around Lake Taupo, and the birds have come in and dropped seed from local native sources. And because there's very low stocking and a lot of light coming through, you can see the natives are coming up underneath. So that's actually an example of passive management, whereas you could actually actively manage by interplanting from the start or thinning progressively and then planting in natives. So I'll run through this quickly, I don't have much time left. Some potential issues. We've talked about what a forest is and the definition. So not all Manuka, for example, does make it to 5 metres. A lot of the Manuka cultivars being grown at the moment for honey have been selected for being very bushy, lots of flowers. So there's some concern that they will not ever reach 5 metres in height. Another one is looking at this riparian plantings, and we've talked about how wide these things have to be. So if you did your riparian planting on an average of 25 metres, well, if you'd only made it at 5 metres more, you could have registered it in the ETS. And again, species, a lot of species being planted, might be ferns, shrubs that will never reach that 5 metre threshold. So just make sure that you've got enough woody tree species that will reach 5 metres to make 30% canopy cover. So it's quite a low number, but you just need to have a well scattering. This on the right is an image from 1988, and it's of a farm in Waikato. And basically it's showing lots of dark, splodgy bits on the red polygon. And that's classic farmland. That's it's a marginal piece. Somebody comes along and says, I want to put that into native forest. Well, guess what? MPI are probably going to look at that and say that was already in native forest in 1990s, so therefore it's not eligible. Just one more slide. Is that me? I think I got a few more minutes from Simon because he was so fast. He gave me a couple of his. All right. Okay, sorry, just really quickly. So 2 schemes for carbon in New Zealand. We've got the ETS, we've already heard a lot about that. There's another one called the Permanent Forest Sink Initiative. The difference with that one is there's a contract, a covenant registered on the title between the Crown and the landowner, and you have to keep it in forest for a minimum of 50 years. So you can't just get out and exit, and there's also quite severe restrictions on harvesting or destroying the forest in any way. So it's a protective covenant. So in some circles it's seen as like the gold standard for conservation. As a result of that, they can get premiums. Z Energy just recently did a deal paying close to 25% above the market rate for a normal NZU. Air New Zealand have a program. They only buy native forest carbon credits from PFSI forests for exactly the same reason. Okay. Right. Yeah, well, this is basically, Madeline just paraphrased this one for me a little bit. I just say that the price can fluctuate a lot. It's easy to get burnt, and the market is created by government. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So what I would really want to say, and I always hammer it home to government, Simon, this is for you, is that for this thing to work, we need to have long-term horizons and viewpoints. And, you know, we need to make it work out 50, 100 years. So we're all busy looking at what the price is today and what was yesterday. But we do need to have some policy stability and price stability to actually get people to have confidence to get out there and plant trees. and it's been a bit of a mess for the last 10 years. So we're going to tie them up outside afterwards. And, oh, we've got some cowpats. So just anyway, quickly, key messages. Native forestry is expensive and lower returns than planting exotics. So it's not going to be the economic return is not the main driver to do it. You can be smart about it and lower the costs. And also you've got to be smart about how you design it so you can benefit from carbon. So that's around the design of the 30 metres and 1 hectare and what species to use. If you're not a purist, think about boosting it with exotics like hardwoods and so on in the early days, and think about the long term. And the last thing was that if you are really committed to conservation and you want that native forest to be there forever, put it under a scheme like the PFSI because you may get a higher carbon price for the units. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Great. Whoa. Okay. So I'm conscious that people are getting a bit fidgety, which is to be expected. It's a lot of information for one's brain. So I'm going to ask everybody to stand up. Everybody stand up. Yep. Yep. Do a little bit of a stretch. Yep. Go up. Stretch. Turn around. Squat. Do whatever you want. You know. Jump up and down. Do something. Okay. And then tell the person next to you what you get and what you don't get. I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Ready? Go. To get us back into the swing of things. Take a seat, please. Okay. Hopefully I haven't lost too many people out the shed just yet. So we will be going outside in just a little while. But before we do, we figured actually might as well just keep you in here for a while. Get your brains full of stuff, and then we'll get you outside. So what's going to be happening right now is Victoria Lamb from Beef and Lamb is going to talk to us about how to measure and then be carbon neutral on farm. So this is something that I know I've been getting a lot of questions from farmers about recently. So hopefully she'll be able to cover those off. There you go.
Thank you. So yes, my name's Victoria Lamb, and I'm a shiny bum from Wellington at present. But I was born on a farm, so I think that sort of almost gives me some claim to understanding farms. Not sure with that. No, fine. Okay. Right, so what I'm going to do is just take you through for a brief overview of the carbon cycle, because it is a bit complicated, along with the difference between greenhouse gases. And then what Beef and Lamb are doing, particularly around their recent environment strategy and the goal of carbon neutrality for the sector. So if you know what the carbon cycle is all about, please bear with me. We'll try and make it fairly short and sweet. Let's go back one. Okay, so yeah, carbon cycles around. It's a natural system. It goes around, it grows, it breaks down, goes back into the atmosphere. The plants harvest it again, spit out oxygen, keep the carbon. And somewhere along the line, we've introduced some animals. They're specifically designed to eat carbon-first type food. They have rumens. So the system now goes around. So the carbon molecule is still cycling around there, but it has a slightly more complex route to get there. So the carbon molecule itself, if you think of that as a carbon molecule, it still goes around. It's still the same carbon molecule. It's still going around in that same circle. It's just doing a number of other things on the way. And the next one, this is where it starts to get a bit complicated, because it depends what that carbon molecule is hooked up to. When it's hooked up to oxygen, it becomes CO2, goes round, plants take in the CO2, spit out the oxygen, keep the carbon. What happens when it's in a rumen is that it joins up with a couple of hydrogen molecules, in fact 4 of them. And this is part of the natural process of digestion of the very grassy matter. So that's what makes ruminants work. They were designed to do that. They were designed to eat the stuff. But one of the byproducts is methane, which is CH4. And the carbon molecule is still there, and it still goes round, but it unfortunately does some rather nasty things while it's there. So, so what happens is that the carbon molecule hooked up to the hydrogen behaves very, very differently. So carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide are what we call long-lived gases. They stay in the atmosphere for a very, very long time. Nitrous oxide is very long. Some of them are between 100, anything up to about the best part of 300 years before it breaks back down again and goes round. Methane is what we call a short-lived gas. It breaks down, its breakdown period is about 12 years. But what happens is that while it's in the atmosphere, it does an awful lot of warming. Unlike CO2, which has a moderate amount of warming associated with it, and it carries on doing it for a long time, the methane does a bit of a warming thing. It's really, really hot. It has what we call a global warming potential of anywhere between about 28 and 35. So it warms anything up to 35 times more than a molecule of carbon dioxide. So because the issue is actually about what the climate is doing and it's getting warmer, that's where the methane becomes really important. So let's go through there. So on the left there is the spike for methane. So you can see that it goes up. There's a really big spike on it. It has a big impact on the warming. It causes the atmosphere to warm, and then it breaks down relatively quickly and then fades away. Next one. So that's the carbon dioxide. It does a bit of a spike. Just bear in mind the scale on the left-hand scale was a bit distorted on these slides, so it's not 100% comparable. But it does a spike, and then it sort of breaks down slowly, and it stays in the atmosphere for quite a long time. So anything up to sort of 200 plus years. So now there you've got a comparison. You've got the methane, big spike, a lot of warming, and then it fades away. The breakdown products of methane, it joins up with oxygen atoms and turns it into carbon dioxide and hydrogen atoms floating around. So it eventually degrades into CO2, which then gets taken back up by the plants and circles back round again. But you can see how the methane sort of tapers off and the carbon dioxide, not as big, but stays there for a much longer period. No, we've lost a couple. Okay. Oh, okay. We've lost a couple of slides. So there were some slides in there which actually just showed you a comparison. So one of the things that happens with methane, because it breaks down really quickly, is that the effect of methane after about the 12 years, if you add the same amount of methane each time, then the methane actually plateaus. And because the new lot comes through, and if you keep sort of doing the loops, it just makes a steady plateau. So if you don't increase the amount of methane that's going into the atmosphere, you actually stop the level of warming. You stop the increase in warming. It doesn't stop some of the warming, but it doesn't get worse. And because we get a lot of methane coming out of ruminant animals, it's the way they work, it becomes a bit of an issue in terms of the climate globally. So you've got CO2, which is coming out particularly from fossil fuels, which has been brought into the atmosphere that shouldn't have been there, that wasn't there before. And then you've got methane. So the combination of those is actually what's doing the damage to the climate. So, we've got to now. Right. So that's why, for us, the gases are important. Livestock produce methane and a bit of nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is another long-lived gas. So we have to actually take responsibility for our methane emissions and our nitrous oxide emissions. So one of the things that we need to do, we're being held to account, particularly in the New Zealand sense. Agriculture is not currently in the emissions in terms of meeting financial obligations. There are reporting obligations at the moment, and as most people know, there's quite a lot of consideration about whether or not agriculture should be fully into the ETS. It's a difficult question. So looking at some of the things, what Beef and Lamb have done with their strategy is say, okay, well, we're part of the problem, we're part of the global climate change, we need to do our bit. Right? We are responsible, we do have emissions, even though we might think that there's a cycle to them, but we're still part of the rest of the community, and we can't just bury our heads in the sand. So what Beef and Lamb have done with the environment strategy was talk to our farmers, a group of farmers, and did a lot of talking with various groups about where they thought we should be heading. So we now have, as a goal, carbon neutrality for the sector. And there are a number of ways that we can do this. And the surprising thing, and this is very sheep and beef slanted, so for the dairy farmers amongst you, I do apologise, this is very sheep and beef focused. But there are a number of ways that we can help do our bit for the climate change. Because, as they said in Paris, we want to try and keep the global warming to no more than 2 degrees and preferably 1.5, and even that's going to be a challenge. So there are ways that we can sequester carbon. So one of the easiest ways of dealing with it is actually sequestering carbon on farm. The tools available for reducing emissions are fairly few and far between. There's a lot of research going on at the moment into ways to do that, but at the moment it's still in development, and for sheep and beef it's probably a little bit further out because sheep and beef farmers don't tend to see their animals every morning, and they can't give them some nice yummies to have that will actually stop them or reduce their methane. So it becomes a bit more problematic. So one of the things that we actually get asked a lot is, well, we've heard about soil carbon. So why can't we count the soil carbon when we're doing this? And one of the things about soil carbon is that it's really, really hard to measure. It varies. So a lot of it depends on your underlying soils. So for those of you who've been digging holes and mapping your soils, hopefully as part of your farm plan, will understand that there's a whole range of different soil types. So some soil types hold carbon really, really well, others don't. So it's very variable. New Zealand soils are very young, relatively speaking. There are very few areas in New Zealand that actually have had significant amounts of carbon taken out of the soils through land use. Some highly cropped areas, but that's about it. So the soil carbon levels are not that much different from pre-farming days. So there's a lot of soil already in there. It's really hard to add carbon to soils when they're actually quite full. You can increase the organic matter, but it doesn't actually bump it up particularly. When it's pretty full, there's not a lot of room to actually make it even fuller. So we know that there's a lot of soil carbon there, but the scientists are having real trouble measuring it in a way that's going to be meaningful, and for farmers, for you guys to be able to go out there and actually measure the soil on your farm is going to be really, really hard. It's not to say that it can't be done in the future, and they are working on it, but it's sort of out there at the moment. The other thing about soil carbon is that it can be lost really, really quickly through no fault of your own. Droughts are the classic example, things that the environment does to you that you have no control over. You can lose high percentages of your carbon, anything up to about 80% of your carbon from soil because of a drought. And you have absolutely no way of controlling that. So including soil carbon is important. You probably don't want to be putting yourself on the ETS with a carbon, getting carbon credits only to have a drought and have to hand them back. So there are swings and roundabouts. Okay, so we still don't know much about it. The research is going on. There's a lot of money going into it and a lot of research through the Pastoral Greenhouse Gas Research Centre and the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research people. So they're putting a lot of work into it, but it's a work in development. Which doesn't mean that as land managers that you can't take that into account and aim to have good soil carbon because you'll know it's there, you can see it. There's high organic matters, so it's going to be having a benefit. It just means that it's hard to count. So one of the things that this has been a very ETS and focused approach. One of the things that in developing the environment strategy is that there's more to soil carbon than just sequestering carbon for ETS or credits. Healthy soils are a really good thing to have on your farm because healthy soils give you healthy pasture gives you animals, and so everybody does well out of it. So there are a whole lot of other reasons for having soil carbon and looking after that and nursing it, not just in terms of whether or not you can claim carbon credits for it. So one of the things that we're looking at is from the farmer's point of view, is being able to have trees. Now trees, and you've heard about trees in the ETS, but trees don't have to be in the ETS. And one of the things that we're looking at is saying to government, well, yes, we understand about trees and our international obligations around trees as part of the ETS and as climate change, but as a farmer, you're only really responsible for the bits that you control. So we're looking at it from the point of view of a farmer and saying, so what about your farm? Can you make your farm carbon neutral? So there are some things you can do in your farm management that will help reduce emissions. Some of the things that you will be doing anyway, so things like increasing your reproductive rate, improved feed, better animal health, using genetics. So there are a whole range of things that can add little bits, but they're not huge, but they will add bits to it. And that will help you, but the main tool that we now have is actually sequestering carbon on farm. So there's a whole range of trees that you have on farm, and from our perspective, on behalf of the farmers, is that all of those trees should count. So what we're looking at doing is having a system that actually allows you to count all those trees and go, right, here are my emissions. And for those of you who have overseer budgets, you'll find that there's a greenhouse gas calculation there. It's pretty straightforward. It's all calculated on the amount of feed that goes into an animal and the energy calculations, so it's fairly standard. But what isn't in an overseer at the moment is how do I count all the trees that I've got on my farm? So what we're looking at doing is producing a tool for you to be able to actually go on your farm and go, okay, so where am I sitting? What's the balance? It doesn't have to be perfect because we're not counting, it's not counting in terms of monetary return. You could have trees that meet the ETS definition and get carbon credits for them if you want to as part of your farm. But there are a lot of other trees that you will have that don't necessarily count. You may not want them to count. It doesn't mean they're not doing a really good job. So what we're doing is saying to farmers, here we're developing you a tool so that you can actually work out where you are on the platform. Do you want to be carbon neutral? You want to be able to say, I've offset all my emissions, or actually, I'm doing better than that. Because it's the right thing to do. You know that it's happening, and we've all got to do a bit, and if everybody does a bit, it's all going to actually help. So there are lots of options for you. What we're doing is coming up with a tool based on the tools that are already available. We're not reinventing things. What we're trying to do is clip together the various bits, because there are lots of bits around, so that you can have a nice, easy to use on-farm tool. It's taking us a wee while. It's going to take us at least another 12 months. It will do things like pull an overseer. And we're using overseer purely as a farm management tool, which is what it was intended for. It is not intended for regulation or for measurement of calculations or any other things that other people might want to do with it. It's about giving you a management tool, clipping it together with the forestry component, clipping it together with a financial tool, so that you can actually work out, so if I do this on my farm, if I have this block and trees and not that block, then what's that going to mean? What's it going to mean for my stocking rate? What am I going to have to do? What classes of animals do I want to run? How am I going to do it? But it gives you a tool to be able to do this for yourselves and work out what you need to do. So in the strategy, we looked at a whole range of reasons why we were doing it. A lot of it came from farmers going, actually, we want to do this. I want to be carbon neutral. Actually, I think I might well be. And for many farmers, they already will be. So there are a whole range of reasons. Trees on farms have other benefits as well. Stock, animal welfare, shelter, shade, erosion prevention, whole range of things. And we see trees and carbon, the issue around climate change, as being one of the things that you manage on your farm holistically. Biodiversity, trees have huge biodiversity values, so they've got other values as well. So it's about integrating all of that stuff across the whole of the farm. So one of the really interesting things is we want all things to count. Domestic policy does not have to be absolutely identical to international policy. And for farmers, what they do on their farm is what's going to count, because it's all going to count. Whether or not it counts internationally is a slightly different issue. I know the MPI guys get a bit upset when I talk to them about this. But so stuff that counts overseas is one thing, but actually what we're doing domestically to actually make that happen is there's a bit of stretch there, which is really, really good. So one of the things that I really like to just share with you is we've just done a piece of research into the amount of biodiversity on sheep and beef farms across the country. So it's just been released last week, before last. There's 2.5 million hectares of native biodiversity on sheep and beef farms in the country. That's an awful lot of hectares. And of that, 1.4 million of those hectares has woody vegetation of classes that would qualify. So it's potential for over 5 metres and growing into forest. 1.4 million hectares of forest trees assessed on sheep and beef farms. That's a huge amount. So one of the things that we also did was have a look to see roughly how many hectares using the sheep and beef survey farms. So there's about 180,000 hectares, we think, of pines or forestry blocks. That gets to about 70% of the offsets. If you go calculation, that's about 70% of the offsets needed to be carbon neutral for the sector, right? Which is huge. So there's only another 30% to get. We worked it out. It works out about 7 hectares of pine trees each for all of the sheep and beef farmers. So we reckon this is really, really doable for the sector. We know that it's not always going to be, everybody won't be doing the same stuff. Some people, and it makes sense to have good quality land used for the best uses and the trees put in the areas where it's best for them to be. So it's going to be a bit horses for courses. Individuals will be able to do some stuff. Not everybody can. Group-based options. A lot of you will be in some form of group, whether it's a production improvement group or a catchment group. But just think about this a little bit laterally. How, as groups in a catchment, could you make your catchment carbon neutral? Particularly if you've got a long catchment with some fat bits at the bottom. We really don't want to be turning our best land into pine plantations or trees and locking it up. We need to get really sensible about how we use our land and what we use it for and getting that balance right. And this is where the right trees in the right place comes. So it may be about sharing things. Okay, so the other little gem is that we're 30% below 1990 levels as a sector. That's quite fortuitous because we've only got half the sheep that we used to have, but they produce only 8% less meat than they used to. Right, so 50% down on sheep numbers, 8% less sheep meat, and that's gone into there. So the other one that I'll share with you, and I think it's on the little piece of paper at the desk, is a really good rough and ready reckoner. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright, in her report in 2016, came up with a nice little calculator. It says for every sheep or every 100 sheep, you need 6 hectares of natives or X number of hectares of pines. And if you want to work out how many sheep and cattle you've got on your farm and then work out how many trees you're going to need to offset it, there's a really, really good place to start before our neutral comes out. Okay. And this was just an example of actually quite a lot of you are probably already there. So that was just an example from last year. What I wish my clients knew. Actually, guys, have confidence in yourselves. You can do this. Be confident. You can. And what I wish I knew 10 years ago, and I'm going to take a little bit of a liberty with that one, is that if I go back a little bit further than that, and a number of you will probably remember, there used to be a thing called the Marginal Lands Board once upon a time. And I started my career in the days of Lands and Survey and the Marginal Lands Board when they were paying you to take your trees off the farm. Things go round and they come round. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Victoria. But today is a field day, after all. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to have Steve take us outside. But before we do, I have some really exciting numbers to share with you. So as Victoria was saying, there's a pretty easy way that you can use some numbers to calculate what your own carbon neutrality is. So if you can just do a slide. Yep. So in your program, it says that Sean is going to be doing this. He was sick last week, so, I got to share the team burden. So first off, how to do this. You need to decide what you're measuring. So if you're only talking about carbon, that's one thing. If you're talking about carbon and methane and nitrous oxides, the difference between those short and long-lived gases, figure out what you're trying to calculate. Then you can estimate how many emissions you have using your overseer budget. So for those in the Tuki catchment, hello all. I have been working on Plan Change 6 and those infamous farm plans. In the nutrient budgets for your farm plans, you have this data already. You just got to call your farm plan provider and get it from them. The other way to do it is to use those back of the envelope calculations. And as Victoria said, at the registration desk, there's this little piece of paper that helps you figure it out yourself. So make sure you take one of these, share it, spread it, copy it, have fun with it. The next thing is to assess the tree removals on your farm. If we haven't figured out that this stuff is complicated from today, this is actually the harder bit in some ways, of all things. So if you have natives or pines, you can use the back of the envelope calculations. If not, you can host a field day and get some calculations done for your business, which is what Steve has done here, which is really great. So next slide, please. Oh, that's not showing up so well. So make sure you take the printed copies, because for some reason it's not really helping. But as a quick indication, for every one sheep, this is an average ewe, you need 0.012 hectares of a pine plantation per sheep, and 0.06 hectares of a native place. So it's all there. You can find it later and outside. But for Steve's farm, where we're at now, we did some calculations, and it turns out that just from his strategic pole planting, using those 200 booster poles, and considering what comes out of his overseer budget, he is quite carbon negative. He is actually doubly carbon negative. And this is just from the poplars and willows that he's been planting over the last 30 years as part of his just land stewardship of this area, right? So he has done a fantastic job of putting poplars on the land, holding the land in place, managing that erosion, keeping his stock happy and healthy, and he can get a ton of credits for it if he chooses, right? But just based on some back-of-the-envelope numbers, he's carbon neutral twice over. So with that, you guys are going to go outside now. Yep.
You wanted to add in the radiata, right? Because I took the numbers.
Oh, cool. Okay. We'll.
Everyone's good at maths, because I'm not. But basically, if you had like 8 hectares of the plantation. Just to add more positivity to the story, I think there's about 8 hectares that would be eligible for post-89 forestry, and that's earning on average around 28 units per annum times that 8 hectares. So what's that? Like 100? There you go.
Yeah. So Simon does his maths really well. He also has a calculator. Always helpful. 224 units per annum from his pines. So what we've just done here is just from the poplars. That's not even considering the pines that you have. And you have like 8, how many? 8 hectares? Okay. Yeah. So he's hunky-dory. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to go outside, be in the field. Please, if you haven't washed your boots, do so. There's a nice little tub by the tree. We've got to make sure that we're biosecurity aware and ready. So Steve is just going to talk us through his planting regime and stuff like that. When you exit, please give your written questions to our handy-dandy catchment advisors who are helping facilitate the day. So this is Joe over here. Hi, Joe. And Nicola, who is running over there. Yep, so she's there. Say hi to Nicola. Please give your written questions to them. We're going to stay behind, organize them all up. We're going to bring you back in here so that we can get lots of questions and answers sorted. And then we're going to have some wonderful barbecue. So with that, everybody up and out.
So I'll just point out the boundaries for a start. The pine trees are in the neighbours, and then you've got the airstrip, the super bin up the back there. That's the boundaries just behind that, and it runs across to a clump of pines that you can see just about on the horizon, and then it narrows up, and there's another 15 odd paddocks out, small paddocks out there where I winter the cattle. And then it comes back over to your right here, that big knob where you can see some sheep just on the side there. That's in the place. That other face in the distance is not ours. The boundary is just this side of that, and it widens out and goes. There's quite a long road frontage. So yeah, like I was saying inside, I think it was about 5,000 poplars and willows I've planted since being here. We try and plant. I started off planting about 100 a year and did that a few years, and just wasn't getting anywhere. So lately we've been doing 300 a year. Well, I've been planting 300 a year. Not every year, because some years you get droughts and you think, well, it's just a waste of time trying to even plant. And I've gone back over a lot of places that I've planted. Like, for instance, just down here, I had 3 goes at trying to plant some of the stuff up on the right, because we had a bad year, and I didn't really want the woolshed ending up down the bottom, because that's where it was looking at one stage. So it doesn't, one of these areas, although you plant an area a year, you have to quite often come back. And as you can see, well, you actually can't quite see, but I've actually gone along the top of this face and planted some more, because it's actually starting to crack up the top. So then you try and you come back at a later date and replant. The last 2 years, we've planted close to 4,000 natives in shelter belts, which you can't see. It's over to the right there and around dams. And this last summer, we let 4 dams go, and we'll replant around those with natives. So it's an ongoing thing, and I never planned it like this. It's just kind of morphed into this. I started out just planting a few, and this country you need something on it. It's typical clay country. It just slimps and slumps. It's almost like lava flows. It falls over itself. So you just got to keep doing it. And it's surprising how quickly it does change. You're probably looking at the farm at the worst time of year. I mean, it looks pretty sparse at the moment, but it can look quite spectacular when in the spring and the autumn. I try and, when I'm getting the poles, I try and keep a variety. So I'll take 25 out on the bike a day, because when I started out, I tried to do 100 a day, and it just about killed you. So I've learnt from my mistakes, and I take 25 out on the bike, because that's what I can fit on the bike. I'll do that in the morning and that in the afternoon if I've got time. And I'll pick up the poles. I might have 6 different varieties of poles, so I'll take one from each pile. So it's diversified. I don't like seeing all the same species in the one spot. There'll be a mixture of poplars and willows. The willows I'm steering away from now. I just noticed, you'll see a few down here, they just make a hell of a mess. I know some people bollard them and trim them back, but that's a hell of a lot of work. And I'm finding as they get bigger, they just break. So I'm steering towards the poplars now. They're harder to establish, but they make a nicer tree and potential for timber in the future too. So we've actually got 300 poles in the dam down there now with their sleeves for this year's planting, and they're all poplars. There's Cara and Veronese, and a few new cloned Lombardis, which are coming back into it. The Lombardis you see over here on the right were the original trees here. When this place was settled, I think they got a grant to plant trees, and a lot of them did in the beginning stages. And then once that grant ran out or whatever, a lot of trees, no one planted trees for a while. So those Lombardis, the original trees back in the 50s were planted, and all the rest pretty much is what I've planted over the years. I mean, it's pretty hard. We haven't got time to go around the farm, but you get a rough idea. And you've seen the drone footage inside there, so you know pretty much what it's like. There's some areas I can't plant. You know, like where the super bin is, the airstrip comes out to an angle across to your right, and then the plane has to wind its way up the gully. So you don't really want to plant trees where a plane's going to fly, because they don't go so good. So I think, yeah, that's about it, really. I mean, as I say, it's just sort of morphed into what it is, and wasn't really planned. But yeah, you get a lot of pride in seeing it now. It was a pretty blank canvas when I started. So yeah, there's a lot of job satisfaction when you see how it looks now. So I think that's about all. Yeah. Hang on. So what I do is I take a chainsaw down there, and I just make a V, point a V in the tree, and I put those on the bike, and just a rammer. I don't do any pilot holes or anything. I mean, if I've got it to a pilot hole, it's obviously going to be too dry, I think, and it's more gear to lug around. So it's just a big rammer, ram it down, and then put the sleeve over, and just in areas. Yeah, I'd like to plant along the higher up, but the establishment is so bloody hard. So it's the wet areas, the areas are slumping and moving. You try and stabilise those. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I've planted them bloody close to initially to try and, I mean, it could be like 5-6 metres if it's a really wet area. But that's initially to try and stabilise the land. And once that's done, well, what I'm doing now, I was actually going through, and you can't notice it, but I had Warwick Heathscape out, and we looked at, because some of these trees are getting quite big, and I'm not liking willows, I was trying to find out the best way to get rid of some of these willows. So what we're doing is we're poisoning the odd willow to try again, because they've been planted so close. So they've done their job, and now I'm just going through and selectively poisoning out some of the willows. So what we do there is I just go around for a chainsaw, do a plunge cut around the tree, and put escort poison in there, and that seems to do the trick. It's cheaper than getting a digger in and chainsaw, and so they'll die standing and slowly break down. But the initial thing, planting them so close, is just to get that land stabilised, especially down the track on the other side there. It's filling, before those trees there, you'd get a bit of a slumber and fill the water table in, and then the water would run over the track. So now that track is good. You're going to have a rainfall event, and it just runs down the water table without, and the trees have stabilised it. They've done their job. So yeah, and it's just, natives aren't making a lot apparently from ETS point of view, but I think aesthetics and adding to the value of the farm itself, I think counts for quite a bit. But yeah.
What we're looking at here is counted as 30% cover and
Yeah, apparently, yeah.
Have you got any silviculture timber type plans for the poplars? Because that's becoming one that you've
Yeah. Well, I haven't done anything like that. It's just a time thing, really. I mean, you go through, and I know some people do prune them up and all the rest of it, but they're not there for a timber species. But in saying that, if it comes that, I don't want to start taking out a whole area of poplars and then find it slumping. I'd rather, if there's too many there and there's potential to make a timber tree out of it, well, then I'll take it out, yeah. But I'm not specifically going through and doing it for timber. Yep, that's right, yep. Could do, yep. But I'm not too sure how that stacks up the ETS too, like you're taking trees out and, so there's all these ifs, buts and maybes. Okay. Oh, okay. Right. Yep. I'm learning something. This is good. Change the stocking rate, isn't sheep? Oh, the cattle. Yeah. Right. No, that is a major issue. I have to keep the cattle. I've got an area out the back where we haven't planted any trees, and that's where I winter the cattle, and that, it is a problem. But I'm, sort of 5 years, and then they can come back in if they're big cattle. But now, once they've got big, and I find actually even when I've planted these ones a year or two ago with the sleeves on that you can just make out of the back there, the cattle actually don't. If they've got other trees, they'll leave those ones alone. They'll rub them against these big trees, and they tend to leave those fresher planted ones alone. So, you definitely, they are a problem, cattle. And if someone could invent something to keep the cattle off poles, that would make a lot of money. A cheap way of keeping cattle off poles would be brilliant. But that is an issue. How much pasture have I lost? I actually think in the summer you'll find the areas underneath the trees are greener than if there's, it retains the moisture and there's a lot of dew and it stays quite green for longer. I'll probably grain pasture at certain times of the year.
There's been some research done about cattle and the temperature that they can get to if they're exposed to too high temperatures throughout the day. So I think it was Massey with the Poplar Willow Trust where if they're able to be in the shade, they're actually able to graze longer and the intake is actually higher. So in terms of production, there's minimal loss in there.
Yes, Phil Ty was just pointing out, we've been involved in Farm Acts for a number of years here, and our feed hasn't dropped off because of the trees. So yeah, it doesn't seem to affect.
While you guys were outside, some of the HBRC team and myself were banging our heads in trying to categorize all of the amazing questions that you guys have come up with. So it's really, really fantastic to see all these questions. We won't be able to get through them all, but if you have registered using your email, or if you've just kind of shown up, please write your email on the registration desk. What we'll do is answer all of these questions for you and send them all out along with the presentation. So please, please, please get your email down, give someone your phone number, we'll get in touch, we'll get those answers to you. So first off the block, we have some questions about eligibility. So what is considered to be eligible? And with that, where is it? Yep, okay. So it's kind of a question of, is it the right one? Yeah. When a forest reaches full maturity, does it stop sequestering carbon? Okay, here, I'm gonna give you guys a microphone. And by the way, so the question and answers are gonna be done by the panelists who we just heard from, as well as from the wonderful woman who is sitting here the entire time, being wonderfully patient and putting everybody's slides. She's also an expert. She is the carbon and climate change expert for Dairy New Zealand. So she's been around the country recently doing roadshows for dairy farmers about all of this stuff. So she's also here. So thanks very much, Milena. Yeah. So again, the question is, when a forest reaches full maturity, does it stop sequestering carbon?
Okay, I'm happy to be corrected and challenged on this by my esteemed Ollie's vigorously nodding his head. Short answer is no, I don't believe that it does. It certainly slows down as forest growth tops off, but it doesn't ever stop. As the tree is growing, it will slowly, very slowly in some cases, continue to sequester carbon. One of the problems you have with things like pine is not so much that it stops sequestering carbon, it is that it is prone to falling over. And once that happens, that is considered a loss of carbon and an emission, so it gets you back to where you started.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically as a forest grows, it's called a sink. It's absorbing carbon, and once it hits its plateau, it becomes a reservoir where it's holding carbon, and it's dynamic. So there's ups and downs, but it's basically like imagine the rainforest at maturity. So you'll have, this is like not the pine forest example, but long-term permanent forests should reach an equilibrium where there's equal new growth as well as the senescence of the old stuff dying. But is a common myth that like your exotics like radiata don't keep growing after 30 years, and that's because most of them have a chainsaw through them at that age. But there's a lot of 100-year-old plus stands of radiata old man pine around the place. So it's all about where it is and what species.
Cool. Okay. Yep. Great. So I'm going to go on to the next question now because there's a lot of really great ones. Thanks for that, guys. What is the lifespan of a carbon unit?
Forever.
Yes.
It doesn't expire.
Yeah. So the quip here in the front was forever, but it depends on government policy, and that's what Ollie was talking about before. We're having it's really important to get that longevity and that certainty and that confidence. Great.
NZUs under the current system are not expendable, so they endure forever. You have them as long as you want, unless you sell them.
Cool.
Simple.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. Why is carbon in soil so hard to measure?
I'm not a soil scientist, and I suspect that actually I was talking to one earlier on. It's because it's very variable, and my understanding is that it's something to do with the chemistry in terms of measuring it. So they just tell me it's hard. So I haven't actually. I'm sorry, not being, but it is, and there's somebody over there who obviously knows better. So,
a couple of years ago, one of the high schools in near Thames, it's either Pyro or Waihi, one of the classes won a prize for developing a test for measuring carbon in soil. So kids can do it in the school lab. No reason why the experts can't except that doesn't suit them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll make sure to send that back to MPI. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, you can measure your own soil carbon in your paddock. I guess the question is how to do that on a larger scale. Yeah. So the next questions are about different tree species and things like that. So first off, you guys haven't mentioned eucalypts. That's one of the questions as an option. How does it compare to other species?
They, in the graphs that myself and Ollie had up earlier, which would be handy, they are considered under the default tables to be an exotic hardwood. So they are a forest species. You can absolutely enter them into the ETS. And if you get sent the slides and go back through them, you'll find that eucalypt growth, particularly in the early years, actually exceeds that of pine.
Cool.
It's super fast.
Yeah, and so in line with questions about alternative species, where do people go to quote, find out the different carbon accumulations of different varieties? So, yeah, and what their responses are. So where do people go?
A couple of ways to do that. The default lookup tables that have been mentioned a couple of times today by both myself and Ollie and Margaret. She has them in her hand.
Yeah.
Just go and talk to her. They actually exist as legislation. They form part of the Climate Change Response Act forestry regulation, so they are law. You can, if any of you ring or email climatechange@mpi.gov.nz or ring 0800 Climate, we can arrange to get a copy of them in paper sent out to you. Easy as. They're also available online. Oh, hang on.
So the Pinus radiata is measured regional, and you've got softwoods, Douglas fir, and hardwoods and Indigenous are measured at a national scale. That's presuming you aren't under the field measurement approach. So I've got a very quick sort of graph of 5 years measuring against them all here if you wanted to have a look later.
Cool. Thanks.
Just quickly, the reason that pine's divided up and the others are national is simply a data issue. There's a lot of pine in the country, which gives us an enormous amount of data to plot and map out the default tables. The other ones are a lot sparser, so we had to run national averages just because of how statistics works.
Cool. So another set of questions that we had lots of questions about this in this category, which is about risk. So what the question here is, what happens if you sell your credits and your forest burns down? Do you have to return the credits you sold?
Yep.
Oh. We can use that mic. Sorry, for recording purposes.
That's fine. You can also get carbon insurance as part of your forestry, and we deal with that as well. So that the short answer is yes.
Cool. Great. And the next question is just
fire, much like windthrow or harvesting, any of those is considered an emission. So your harvest is your intentional emission, absolutely, but windthrow in certain circumstances, and certainly removal of the trees through fire, the trees are simply a carbon stock. So as soon as that carbon stock decreases, for any reason, it is considered an emission. Over time, you remember the graph that came up first, your harvest will go down, then your new planting will grow up, so you'll have a dip, and then over time it will increase, but you will still be liable for that immediate emission. No, they have not.
No. Okay.
That is the thing going to is a little strong. The thing I alluded to at the end before was about averaging. It's one of the things that we're looking at the moment to try and ease out some of these things and remove complexity. Will achieve what you were talking about there, but it is. It is currently being consulted on.
Yeah. So
very shortly.
Yeah. So we have another wonderful category about government policy and some questions about that. So don't worry, we'll be coming back to it. So the next question is about funding schemes. So, quote, Shane Jones sent us a letter trying to get 200 hectares for tree planting. Will he be considering smaller areas?
I would suspect as part of the Billion Trees work, the Billion Trees work is still very much in its infancy. The Minister has made very clear that he's looking to get out and establish these trees in any ways and forms and stuff. So I think there will be future work coming up that will deal with smaller scale lots and planting of that nature. As yet, there's been nothing firm that's been decided.
Cool. And another plug for HVRC folks here. We're also doing our own planting scheme as well. So that is also in the kind of development stage. We're hoping to work with and in addition to the Billion Trees program. So make sure that you keep in contact with your regional catchment management advisor to keep up to date with all of that and just ask us any questions, and we'll try to give you as much information as we have. So,
Can I just add one to that? One thing, you might not have 200 hectares, but you might have 70, and the bloke next door to you might have another 70, and the person over the back fence might have another 70, and all lo and behold, you've managed to get to 200. Doesn't have to be owned by the same person as long as they're relatively contiguous, and you could join them up if you wanted to.
Yep, cool.
Yeah, so if you've got close to but under, the Crown is still wanting to talk to you.
Cool, good to know. So there's quite a few questions about what is this compliance period you speak of? So what is this? And then if you miss one, can you claim later? Like how does that all work?
All right. Okay.
Uh-oh.
No. This is, yeah. Oh, it's getting hot. This is one of the problems where I have to come and go through the ETS in 15 minutes without breathing in. And you end up with a sort of another layer or two layers of complexity around what this stuff is and how these things work. The ETS, for the sake of accounting, is broken up into 5-year blocks. These are called mandatory emissions return periods. They're always done in 5-year blocks up until we decide to change it. The first one ran from 1st of January 2008 to 31 December 2012. It's called period 1, compliance period 1. The second period has just finished and it shut 31 December 2017. So it ran from 1 January 2013, 31 December 2017. And then you move forward until we're now into the third period. Okay. At the end of each of those periods in the 5th year, as at 1 January the year following, it's called a mandatory emissions return. So anyone that is in the ETS with post-Allen Forest is required to lodge a return that addresses any and all units across that last 5-year period. Once that is done, that period is considered to have shut, and then you guys, any participants, move forward claiming. This obviously creates issues whereby if you decide this year to register trees that are 15 years old, you've done yourself out of 8 years of carbon, or 10 years of carbon, which is unfortunate, but that for the way that this works, and it's tied into how New Zealand's international accounting requirements work, that is how the system works. So that is what the compliance periods are.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, now I have some questions about what I'm calling ag emissions. So I'm guessing that one of the two industry representatives can answer these. So quote, given long-term methane is net neutral with no change in stocking, if we have improved by 30%, have we essentially earned carbon credits as a sector? Whew.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you rephrase the question as well?
Yeah. I suspect that the crux of the matter is for the sector. That's why I said it was for sheep and beef. So what's happened with the removal of the 27 million sheep is that somebody else has moved in. Hence the comment. But we are very mindful that all dairy farmers are beef farmers. They pay their levies too. So it's very much about trying to work with the sectors. So hence the catchment approaches and things, because it doesn't make good land use sense to actually put good land into trees when you can be using it for much more productive purposes, when you can't get the cows to walk up the hills. So you've got to be really sensible about how we do this. So
as a whole, New Zealand's emissions for methane since 1990 have gone up by 5%. So that is what we're liable for as NZ Inc. to the international community under our Paris Agreement. And so that's for methane. For nitrous oxide, it's gone up by 28%, I believe. So those are the emissions that are applicable that are currently not under the ETS. So agriculture already is in the ETS, as Victoria said, and that is both for a reporting requirement for those nitrous oxide and methane emissions, but it's also for its carbon dioxide emissions, but those sit under the different industry categories, so the different categories of the inventory. So industry, transport energy. So processing milk, transporting your goods, that the agriculture sector does pay for. So overall, the emissions have gone up. They would have gone up by a lot more had both the sheep and beef sector and the dairy sector not gotten more efficient over time. However, when it comes to 2030, New Zealand as a whole will be liable for those emissions, along with all of our carbon dioxide emissions. And so as a nation, we have to try to figure out how we can reduce those as much as we can overall, and then offset what we can't reduce.
Awesome, thanks. And kind of along the same line, and I think then we're going to open it up to the floor while we have another 5 minutes before we have to wrap up. So the question is, carbon neutrality, does that equal meeting our reduction goals? And if we're carbon neutral now, is that enough to meet our international obligations?
So in terms of the international obligations, as I think I said, we're looking at it from a farm perspective because that's only what farmers can do. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's within the international obligations, because to be counted, it needs to be essentially in the ETS to be counted. So this is where the choice comes about whether you want to do the things on farm that count within the ETS, or are looking at it from your business point of view. And that's the difference that we make. We still have these international obligations that have to be met, though.
I think that's correct. I think there is quite a difference between carbon neutrality on farm, which is absolutely a good thing, and benefits derived under the ETS. There are things included in the ETS and there are things that aren't, and those things exist for a variety of reasons to do with legislation and international commitments and the ability to accurately report and all the rest of it. What that looks like moving forward remains to be seen. There's any number of things that can happen, but your ETS, your primary sequestering vehicle in the ETS is forestry at the moment, and those forestry levels are set at a hectare and all the rest of it. Soil carbon, for complexity that's already been mentioned, isn't included, but that by no means should preclude you people from looking at ways to minimise and better improve the neutrality on your farms.
Cool. Well, any questions? Yep, hold on. I'm going to send this mic back to you. Because, again, we're trying to record the day so folks in the future can benefit from us.
So just following on from that, is the only way for if we create carbon neutrality on the farm, for it to count on an international scale, it's got to be part of the ETS?
No, the ETS is devolved down. The ETS devolved down domestically. How ag emissions are accounted for internationally is slightly different, but certainly soil-borne carbon and things like that aren't counted. So,
I guess the other important thing to consider with offsetting is the way that the inventory offsets or takes those offsets from forests and deducts them from our gross emissions is at a economy-wide scale. So there are specific categories in the inventory that are the emitters. So industrial processes, transport, energy, agriculture, waste. Those are all the categories that are emitters. And then there's a category called LULUCF. So that's land use change, and forestry. And that is where all of the offsets that are being made by forests are captured and used against our emissions as a whole when New Zealand has to report against its target. And so that ultimately is where it drops. So it doesn't break it down to, it doesn't break that LULUCF category down against where each of those came from in terms of whether it was sheep and beef, whether it was Air New Zealand planting some forest, whether, it just counts it all together against our emissions.
Cool. Okay. While I'm back here, are there any questions back in this little holding pen area? Sorry, guys. You guys have done so well back here all day. Any questions back here? No, but shell shocked. Cool. Okay. In that case, I know that there's a question up here. Excuse me. Pardon me. Great. Okay.
question for Simon. There seems to be some conflicting information floating around about the level of, or future level of enduring carbon. And currently we are at around 20% New Zealand. There's some talk of it actually going to 60%. Is that hope, legislation in progress, or overseas interpretation? Because that is probably one of the most important things to encourage farmers to plant more trees as to the level of enduring carbon and also the interpretation of the laws around it, because I feel that a lot of the laws overseas are set for a different style of tree to our New Zealand fast-growing Pinus radiata. Can you just elaborate on what the interpretation is on that and what's likely to happen in the future?
Crikey. Okay, you did. Okay, that's a multifaceted question, that one. First things first, enduring carbon. So I take that to mean what is often referred to as the risk-free carbon, where your carbon forest cycle grows, you harvest it, you replant, and it grows. You've got the bit underneath that never gets to zero. Fine. So that varies often to do with species and location in the country. Faster growing trees can have more and the rest of it. That sits at between 20 and 30% is my understanding. The enduring carbon getting to 60% that you mentioned before, I'm not aware of that. My guess is that is probably some of the averaging calculations that I've mentioned, whereby you grow up, you get your long-term forest average, and then your harvest cycles don't matter anymore. So you get given out one lot of carbon and that is it. There's no gain, loss, gain, loss, gain, loss. It just trucks forward. What the future looks like remains to be seen. However, as I've mentioned before, averaging is being considered actively at the moment and will form part of sort of ongoing review and consultation stuff as part of the ETS review. So it's very actively being considered by government at the moment. The last element of your question, you talked about forest settings internationally. Now, you are quite right. New Zealand, with quite clear and deliberate intent, chose the forest settings that it did. And they differ from other countries for a number of reasons. And often with us, within the New Zealand domestic setting, it is to do with providing benefit where benefit is due and not overburdening. For example, fruit and nut trees. Trees used primarily for fruit and nut crops aren't included in the ETS because that's an orchard. It's being run and farmed a different way. You don't want to get involved in that. The height limits are to avoid inadvertently capturing gorse and things like that farmers would normally be clearing as part of normal farming practice. Unlike, for argument's sake, if you're Russia and your tundra forest maxes out at 2 meters, having a forest height of 5 meters isn't going to help you much, is it? So all countries set themselves up differently in best reflection of what they have in country at the time, and New Zealand is no different.
Cool.
So I think you're also talking about harvested wood products as part of the mix. Yeah. So yeah. And I can't speak for the government, but what I will say is this. Well, what they're going to do is, no, seriously, I think what you just said about the 60%, I've done a lot of calculations on this stuff. If you add in harvested wood products, for those who don't know, we've got a lot of harvested wood products here with embedded carbon in this shed. And it's the idea that you don't lose all the carbon at once. Some of it's retained as wood in products that we continue to use. Combine that with averaging, which Simon's already talked about, you start to see around those numbers of 60 to 70%. But you have to be aware that averaging means that once you earn up to that long-term average, it's a one-off hit at the front end. You do not then earn anything else ever again. So I know there's a lot of work government are looking at. There's consultations about who's going to get what, who owns that harvested wood product carbon, for example. Is it the foresters? Is it the wood processors? So there's a lot of unanswered questions that hopefully we'll know about in months to come.
Cool. So with that, I'm really conscious of time. 2 of our presenters have to go and catch a flight. So thank you all very much. Can I please have a round of applause for our presenters? Yep. So before Milena and Ollie go away, I do have some gifts for them. So please, when you wander out, please take a bottle of wine. Thank you very much. And I will see you guys in Wellington. So thank you all very much. Ollie's contact is in the the brochure for the day. I think Milena's is. If it isn't, she has her card ready. We'll send it out in the email. So there you go. Yep.
My phone number isn't in that brochure, but I've bought a lot of business cards, which I'll just leave like scattered around and over here somewhere. Yeah, so thanks.
Awesome. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. Okay, so that concludes the formal part of our day, all the content. But before we let you guys go for a barbecue, Crow Horwath just wants to say a little spiel.
Not really a spiel, but I'd just like to pass my thanks to the speakers too, and really appreciate your time. And it's never an easy gig sometimes when got Mark asking curly questions, but I thought he did pretty well there. So on behalf of us, we've really enjoyed putting this day together with HBRC, and there's been a lot of questions, a lot of information. Like, so you won't have all the answers today. We'll get those to you. You've seen the cameraman in the background. They're there for a reason, so we want to create a resource that we can send out to you as a reference point, because often the next best question comes from reflection and some of the information that you then digest. But on behalf of Crow Horwath, we really enjoyed being part of it. We've got the team downstairs been cooking away there, the storm for you, so please stay and enjoy some hospitality on us. Drive safe, but today you've got accountants giving you free beer, free food, and potentially a bit of free advice, so that doesn't happen too often. So take advantage of that, and I also like to thank Madeline for all her work and the rest of the HBR crew, and enjoy the day.
Yeah, so a super big thanks not only to the presenters for all their hard work, but especially to Steve for hosting us here today. It's been a lot of work back and forth, getting all the records together, cleaning out the shed, getting the shingle on the road, all of this great stuff. So please give us a round of applause for Steve. Thanks, Steve.
I'd just like to add to that, Madeline's been really, and Sean, but Madeline has just been enthusiastic. It's just been very infectious, and she's put a hell of a lot of work in this day, and I think a lot of thanks has got to go to Madeline. So thanks, Madeline.